Close your eyes for a moment and picture a fairy. What do you see? Perhaps a tiny, delicate creature with gossamer wings, sprinkling magic dust from a wand. Perhaps a glowing sprite darting through the air. Perhaps a benevolent godmother appearing to grant wishes to the deserving. This is what we have been taught. Popular culture, Victorian illustrators, and centuries of careful, deliberate sanitization have given us these pretty lies, wrapped in glitter and good intentions. Safe stories for safe times. But I must tell you something, and I say this with the weight of years spent in dusty archives, in crumbling folklore collections, in conversations with the last generation who remember the old ways. The real fairies, the ones our ancestors feared with a terror so profound it shaped their entire lives, the ones who haunted the old forests and lonely moors and forgotten ruins, were nothing like this. They were not helpers. They did not grant wishes or leave coins under pillows or dance prettily on mushrooms in the moonlight. And they were never, ever innocent. Tonight, we journey into the forgotten folklore of the British Isles and beyond, where fairies were not whimsical sprites, but dangerous beings of immense power. Creatures who stole children from their cradles and left horrors in their place, who led travellers to their demise in bogs and rivers and cliff edges, who demanded tribute in blood and milk and offerings, bringing ruin, madness and catastrophe to entire villages when refused. This is the dark truth about fairies. The truth systematically erased, rewritten and sanitized over 2 centuries, until we forgot what our ancestors knew in their bones. That when you heard music in the forest at twilight, ethereal and beautiful, you did not dance toward it, you ran. When you saw lights moving through the marsh on a foggy night, you did not investigate. You turned away. When you found a ring of mushrooms in a clearing, perfect and symmetrical, you did not step inside. You walked around, eyes down, making the sign of the cross. Because to do otherwise was to invite something into your life that you could never escape. Welcome. I am Mr. Ravenhurst. And this is the complete history of what fairies really were before we made them safe. Before we turned them into merchandise and children's entertainment and harmless superstition. This is the story of beings our ancestors understood to be as real as the rain, as dangerous as the plague, and as impossible to reason with as the sea in storm. So light a candle if you wish. Pull your chair closer to the fire. Lock your door. Not because it will help, but because it will make you feel safer. And let us begin. Chapter 1. The Nature of the Fae. Before we can understand what fairies do, we must first comprehend what they are. And here, immediately, we encounter a problem. In folklore tradition, fairies are not one thing. They defy categorization entirely. The Irish called them the Sidhe. The Scots named them the good folk or the fair folk, though these titles were not affection, but propitiation. Calling them good did not mean they were benevolent. It meant you hoped desperately that by flattering them they might leave you alone. The Welsh knew them as the Tylwyth Teg, the fair family. In Cornwall, Piskies. In Devon, Pixies. In the Scottish Highlands, the Dinar Sidhe, the people of peace. None of these were their true names. Speaking a fairy's actual name gave it power over you, or you over it, depending on who was stronger. And since humans were never stronger, true names stayed hidden, forgotten, or never spoken at all. So what were they? These beings that haunted every corner of the British Isles, appearing in the folklore of every village and town and lonely farmstead. The oldest answer, appearing again and again in the earliest sources, is this. They are the old gods. The deities of the land before Christianity came. When the new religion spread across Ireland and Britain, when druids were destroyed and sacred places were built over with churches, the gods did not disappear. They diminished. They retreated. They became smaller, less powerful, but no less real. The Tuatha De Danann, the divine race of Irish mythology, became the She. The gods of earth and forest and water transformed into spirits of those places, still powerful, still demanding respect, but no longer openly worshipped. Christianity could not destroy them, so it tried to diminish them, to make them less than angels, less than demons, somewhere in between. Fairies, in this understanding, are fallen deities, gods in exile, and they have not forgotten what they once were. Another theory, equally ancient, suggests fairies are the deceased, not all who have passed, but a specific category, those who perished unbaptized, those who met violent ends, unavenged, those too good for one fate, but not good enough for another, trapped in liminal existence between worlds. The folklore overflows with stories of people recognizing their deceased relatives among the fairy hosts, trapped in eternal procession, unable to rest, unable to move on. A third theory, darker still, proposes fairies are demonic entities. Not the grand figures of theological literature, not the generals of the underworld, but lesser beings. Spirits of mischief and malice who feed on human suffering, cast down from heaven, but not all the way to the depths, remaining here in our world, tormenting us. The medieval church often took this position. Fairies were devilish. To consort with them was dangerous. To leave them offerings was forbidden. And yet, common people continued to believe, continued to propitiate, because theology offers cold comfort when your child is sick and wasting away, when the old woman down the lane says something has replaced them, offering a ritual that might, just might, bring your real baby back. But here is what all these theories share. Fairies are not human. They do not think as we think. They do not value what we value. They are fundamentally other, fundamentally alien, and any attempt to understand them through human frameworks of morality or reason is doomed to failure. Fairies are not malicious in the way humans are malicious. They do not sin. They do not feel guilt. They simply exist, like a storm exists, like a wolf exists. They have their own natures, their own drives, their own incomprehensible purposes, and humans are, to them, resources, toys, amusements, occasionally useful, frequently entertaining, ultimately disposable. This is the first thing you must understand about fairies. They are not your friends. They will never be your friends. Any kindness they show is transactional at best, and more often, a trap. Fairies inhabit the liminal spaces, the places between field and forest, between land and water, between day and night, between the mortal world and whatever lies beyond. In Ireland, they dwell in the hollow hills, the she-mounds, ancient burial sites older than memory, rising from the landscape like the backs of sleeping giants. To disturb these mounds, to dig into them, to remove stones from them, was to invite catastrophe. Your crops would fail, your cattle would sicken, your children would be taken. The examples are endless, recorded well into the 20th century. Farmers who refused to plough certain fields because a fairy mound stood there. Roads that curved around these hills rather than crossing them, adding miles to the journey because to do otherwise was unthinkable. In Scotland and northern England, they inhabit the old forests, places where oak and ash and thorn grow together, the sacred triad, where the canopy is so thick that daylight never fully penetrates, where the air smells of decay and growth in equal measure. These forests were not pleasant places for recreation. They were dangerous. People who entered sometimes did not return, and those who did return were changed. They spoke of music that led them in circles, of beautiful people who appeared and disappeared. of time that moved strangely, so that what felt like an hour was actually a day, or a year, or a decade. In Cornwall and Wales, fairies haunt the mines. The knockers, they were called, spirits of the deep earth who would warn miners of cave-ins by knocking on the walls. But they demanded respect, demanded offerings. Woe to the miner who mocked them or failed to leave a portion of his lunch in the tunnels. The knockers would lead him astray in the darkness, into unmapped passages, into flooded shafts, into places where the air ran out and the candle guttered and went dark. And everywhere, in all regions, fairies inhabit the threshold places, crossroads, bridges, doorways, gates, the boundary between one parish and another. These places, where one thing ends and another begins, are theirs. To linger in such places at twilight, at dawn, at midnight, is to risk encounter. There is a geography of the uncanny mapped across the British Isles. Every village had its fairy places, the tree that must not be cut, the well that must receive offerings, the field where the mushrooms grow in circles, the ruins where no one shelters. These places were known, marked, avoided. Knowledge of them was passed down generation to generation, not through books, but through lived experience and whispered warning. This is gone now, mostly. The forests have been cleared, the roads straightened, the mounds excavated by archaeologists, the mines abandoned. Modernity has scraped away the liminal spaces, and in doing so, scraped away the geography of fairy belief. But the stories remain, and the stories remember what we have forgotten. Fairies are not always present. They are not watching you every moment, despite what the folklore sometimes implies. They have their own seasons, their own times, their own rhythms that intersect with human time in specific, predictable ways. The most dangerous times are the quarter days, the old Celtic festivals that mark the turning of the year. Samhain on the eve of November 1st, when the veil between worlds is thinnest, when the deceased walk and the fairy hosts ride out in great procession. Im-Olc on the eve of February 1st, the beginning of spring, when the earth stirs and the old powers wake from winter sleep. Beltane on the eve of May 1st, when fertility and growth and wild energy surge through the land, and the fair folk dance in the fields. Lunasa on the eve of August 1st, the first harvest, when debts are called in and bargains are settled. On these nights you stayed indoors, you covered your windows, you burned protective herbs, rowan, vervain, and elder. You placed iron across your threshold, and you did not, under any circumstances, go outside. Because the fairy hosts were riding, great cavalcades of otherworldly beings, mounted on horses that were not horses, travelling roads that were not roads, visible only to those with the sight, or to those unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And if they saw you, if you witnessed their procession, you would be taken, swept up into their company, whether you wished it or not, carried away into their realm. Some who were taken this way returned, eventually, changed, haunted, unable to settle back into mortal life because they had seen too much, experienced too much. They would waste away, pining for the other world, for the beauty and the music and the timeless existence they had briefly known. Or they would go mad, unable to reconcile what they had experienced with the mundane reality of farm and village and church. Others never returned at all. But the quarter days were not the only dangerous times. Twilight was always perilous. That hour between day and night when the light is failing but darkness has not yet fallen. The gloaming, it was called. A word that sounds soft, but meant danger. Fairies are crepuscular creatures. They belong to the in-between times, and twilight is the ultimate in-between. Dawn, similarly, was a threshold time. The hour when night beings must return to their hidden places, when they are most active, most desperate, most dangerous. And midnight, of course, the witching hour, when one day becomes another, when the world is poised between and anything can happen. If you valued your safety, you were indoors by dusk and did not venture out until full daylight. The night belonged to them. Fairies can look like anything. This is important. There is no one fairy appearance, no standard form. They are shapeshifters by nature, or perhaps they have no true form at all, simply appearing to humans in whatever guise suits their purpose. Sometimes they are beautiful beyond description. Men and women of impossible perfection, dressed in clothes that shimmer like moonlight on water, with voices like music and faces that haunt your dreams forever after. This beauty is a weapon. It dazzles. It enslaves. People who saw the fair folk in their full glory often fell in love instantly, desperately, spending the rest of their lives trying to find them again, neglecting family and work and every earthly attachment in pursuit of a glimpse of that otherworldly beauty. Sometimes they are hideous, twisted, deformed creatures with too many limbs or too few, faces that are almost human but wrong, in ways that make your eyes hurt to look at. Bodies covered in scales or bark or fur. These forms are meant to frighten, to repel, to make you run, and you should run. Sometimes they are invisible, present but unseen, making their presence known only through sounds, laughter in an empty room, footsteps on the stairs when you are alone, whispers that you cannot quite make out but know somehow are about you. This invisibility is perhaps the most unnerving manifestation, because you cannot fight what you cannot see. You cannot appease what you cannot find. You can only endure, hoping they grow bored and leave. And sometimes, most cunningly, they appear perfectly ordinary. A traveller on the road who asks for directions, an old woman selling herbs at the market, a child lost in the woods. They look human, they sound human, they act human, right up until the moment they drop the disguise and reveal what they truly are. This is why hospitality was sacred, why you never turned away a stranger at your door, why you offered food and shelter even when you had little to spare. Because any stranger might be a fairy in disguise. And if you treated them poorly, if you violated the ancient laws of hospitality, the consequences would be severe. But hospitality was also dangerous, because inviting a fairy into your home, even unknowingly, gave them power over that space. They could return. They could claim what was theirs by right of invitation. The careful balance, the tightrope walk, was to be generous, but not too generous. To offer the required minimum of hospitality, nothing more. Bread and water, a place by the fire. Basic courtesy. But not your best food, not your private chambers, not your trust. Because fairies are deceivers, magnificent, effortless deceivers who can spin truth and falsehood together so seamlessly that you cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. They will promise you anything: wealth, love, power, knowledge. And they will deliver technically. But there will always be a catch, always a price, always a consequence you did not foresee, hidden in the exact wording of the bargain you made. This is their nature, not malice exactly, though malice is part of it, but rather a fundamental difference in how they perceive truth and obligation. What we call deception, they call flexibility. What we call cheating, they call cleverness. And they expect the same in return. If you can outwit them, if you can find the loophole in their bargain, they will honor that. Grudgingly, perhaps, but they will honor it. The problem is that humans are not as clever as we think we are, and fairies have had millennia to perfect their craft. This brings us to the question that haunts all fairy folklore. What do they want from us? Why do they interact with humans at all? Sometimes the answer is simple. entertainment. Fairies are easily bored, and humans are amusing. Our emotions are intense, our lives short and dramatic. Our struggles and triumphs and failures provide endless diversion. So fairies play with us. They create situations and watch how we react. They test us. They torment us. Not out of hatred, but out of the same impulse that makes a cat play with a mouse. Sometimes they want our labor. Fairies are often depicted as living in great luxury, but someone has to maintain that luxury. And while they possess magic, magic apparently does not do everything. So they steal humans to be servants, laborers, wet nurses for their sickly children. These people are taken into the fairy realm and worked until they are used up, then discarded. If they return at all, they return broken. Sometimes they crave our vitality, our life force. Fairies, in many traditions, are depicted as essentially immortal but not truly alive. They do not age, but they also do not grow or change. They are static, eternal, and this eternality comes at a cost. They are cold, empty. They need human warmth, human energy, human life to feel anything at all. This is why they steal babies, not just to replace their own sickly children, but because human infants are pure life force. Unbaptized, unformed, full of potential. Fairies feed on this. They drain it. And when the baby is hollow, empty, deceased in all but name, they discard it. Sometimes they want our belief. This is a more modern interpretation, but it appears in enough folklore to warrant consideration. Fairies, like gods, may require worship, or at least acknowledgement, to maintain their power. As belief in them faded, as Christianity displaced the old ways, fairies diminished. They became weaker, smaller, less able to affect the mortal world. The offerings stopped, the rituals ceased, and the fairies, starving for attention, became more desperate, more aggressive, more willing to harm humans just to make us remember they exist. And sometimes, rarely, they seek our help. There are stories of fairies asking humans for assistance. A fairy woman needing a midwife to deliver her child. A ferryman needing a blacksmith to repair an iron tool, even though iron burns them because no fairy can work iron themselves. These requests are dangerous because accepting means entering into an obligation, and fairy obligations are binding. But refusing is more dangerous still. So humans helped, and were rewarded sometimes. A purse of gold, a magical gift, protection from harm. Or they were punished for seeing too much, for asking too many questions, for breaking some unspoken rule they did not know existed. There is no consistency in fairy behavior, no reliable pattern. What pleases one fairy enrages another. What saves you in one encounter dooms you in the next. This unpredictability is the point. Fairies are chaos. They are the reminder that the world does not follow human rules, human logic, human expectations. And that is terrifying, because we like to believe the world makes sense, that if we are good, good things will happen, that if we follow the rules, we will be safe, that there is justice and order and meaning. Fairies say no, there is none of that. There is only us, and we do as we please. This is the nature of the Fae. And understanding this, truly understanding this, is essential to everything that follows. Because when you know what fairies are, when you know where and when and how they appear, when you know what they want, then the stories stop being quaint folklore and become something else entirely. They become survival manuals, warnings encoded in narrative, knowledge passed down because it meant the difference between life and ending, between keeping your child and losing them, between sanity and madness. Our ancestors did not tell these stories to entertain children. They told them to keep children alive, and we forgot. Chapter 2. the seelie and unseelie courts. In Celtic folklore, particularly in Scotland and Ireland, fairies were not solitary creatures living isolated existences in mushroom rings or beneath bridges. They were organized, hierarchical. They had kingdoms, courts, nobility, complex social structures that rivaled anything in human civilization. And there were two of them, locked in eternal opposition, the Sheelie court and the unsheelie court, light and dark, order and chaos, summer and winter. But do not mistake this for a simple battle between good and malicious. Both courts were dangerous. Both could destroy you. Both operated by rules so alien to human understanding that even attempting to navigate them was perilous. The only difference was their disposition toward mortals. The Sheelie court might, under certain circumstances, leave you alone. The unsheelie court would not. Let us begin with the Sheelie, for they are easier to comprehend, at least superficially. The word Sheelie comes from the Old Scots, meaning blessed, holy, or fortunate. These were the fairies of light, of summer, of growth and life and beauty. They rode out on white horses with silver bridles. They wore garments that shimmered like starlight, woven from materials that had no name in human languages. Their music could make you weep with longing. Their beauty was so profound that mortals who saw them often lost the ability to find human faces attractive ever again. They held court in the hollow hills, in vast underground palaces lit by a light that was not fire and not sunlight, but something in between. These halls were filled with impossible splendor, tables laden with food that never diminished, fountains flowing with wine that never ran dry, dancers who never tired, musicians who never stopped playing. It was paradise, eternal, perfect, and utterly inhuman. The Sheelie court was bound by codes of honor. This is what made them different from their dark counterparts. They had rules, laws, traditions that governed their behavior. And if you understood these rules, if you were very, very careful, you might interact with them and survive. The first rule was respect. You acknowledged their presence. You showed deference. When you passed a fairy hill, you bowed. When you used a path they were known to travel, you stepped aside. When you heard their music, you did not interrupt or mock. Simple courtesy in theory. But the consequences for failure were not simple at all. The second rule was reciprocity. If the Sheelie court gave you something, you owed them, always. The debt might be called in immediately, or it might lie dormant for years, even generations. But it would be called in. A farmer who found his fields suddenly fertile, who had a record harvest after leaving offerings at a fairy mound, would be expected to return the favor when the court required it. And what the court required might be reasonable, a few sacks of grain, or it might be unreasonable, your firstborn child. You had no way of knowing until the debt was called. The third rule was silence. What you saw in the fairy realm, what you heard, what you experienced, you did not speak of. Not to your family, not to your priest, not to anyone. The Sheelie court valued their privacy absolutely, and those who violated it were punished. How? The methods varied. Sometimes you simply disappeared, taken back into the fairy realm, this time not as a guest but as a prisoner. Sometimes you went mad, your mind shattered by what you had witnessed, unable to cope with the memory. Sometimes you withered, aging decades in days, as all the time you had spent in the timeless otherworld came due at once. The fourth rule, and perhaps the most important, was this: never eat their food, never drink their wine. Because food in the fairy realm was binding. One bite, one sip, and you belonged to them. Your body might still be in the mortal world, but your soul was theirs. You would pine for the other world, unable to enjoy mortal food, mortal drink, mortal pleasures. You would waste away, starving in the midst of plenty, because nothing on earth could satisfy you anymore. This rule appears in every tradition. Greek mythology had it with Persephone and the pomegranate seeds. Germanic folklore had it with those stolen by elves. Celtic folklore was absolutely explicit. Do not eat, do not drink, no matter how hungry, how thirsty, how tempting the feast before you, because that feast is a trap. But here is the cruelty of the Shealy court. They did not force you. They did not hold you down and pour wine into your mouth. They simply presented the temptation and waited. And humans, being human, being weak and curious and unable to resist what we are told not to do, almost always failed. There are hundreds of stories of people taken to fairy feasts. Farmers invited into the mound after performing some service. Young women seduced by fairy lovers. Children lured with promises of sweets and games. In every story, the warning is given. In most stories, the warning is ignored. And the consequence is always the same. They stayed forever, or they returned, but wrong, hollowed out, ghost-like, unable to fully exist in the mortal world, unable to return to the fairy realm, trapped between. The Shealy court could be generous. This must be acknowledged. There are stories of people who pleased them, who followed the rules perfectly, who were rewarded with genuine gifts, a purse that never emptied, a tool that never broke, protection from harm, long life, prosperity. But generosity and kindness are not the same thing. The Shealy court gave gifts because it amused them, or because a debt was owed, or because it served some purpose humans could not fathom. Not out of compassion, not out of love. They were not capable of these things, and their gifts always came with strings. A woman given a pot that produced endless porridge was told never to let the pot sit empty. One night, exhausted, she forgot. The pot was empty for a single night. The next morning, her firstborn child was gone. Taken. Payment for the broken rule. A man given a magical plough that tilled a field in an hour was told never to use it on Sunday, the Lord's Day. For years, he obeyed. Then one harvest season, desperate to finish before the rain came, he ploughed on a Sunday. The plough turned into a serpent and ended him. These are not aberrations. These are the norm. The Shealy court operated by contract, and contracts with fairies were always written in blood. Twice a year, on Beltane Eve and Samhain Eve, the Shealy court rode out in great procession. This was not a war party or a hunting expedition. It was simply their custom. A grand parade of the other world, moving through the mortal realm, asserting their presence, claiming their dominion. To witness this procession was to be changed forever. The accounts are remarkably consistent across centuries. A great company on horseback, numbering in the hundreds or thousands, all impossibly beautiful, all dressed in splendor, all silent except for the music of silver bells on their bridles and the faint, unearthly melodies that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. They rode in perfect formation, nobles at the front, on white horses caparisoned in silk and gold. Then the warriors in armor that gleamed like mirrors. Then the courtiers and servants and attendants in descending order of rank. And at the very end, the captured humans, mortals who had offended or attracted or simply been in the wrong place. They walked behind the horses, eyes downcast, silent, enchanted into obedience. If you were in the path of this procession, you had moments to decide your fate. You could flee, run from the road, into the forest or field, hoping they did not notice you. This was the safest option, though not perfectly safe. If they decided to hunt you, they would catch you. But if you were lucky, if you were fast, if you showed proper fear and respect by fleeing, they might let you go. You could stand aside, step off the road, bow your head, let them pass. This was the respectful choice, the choice that acknowledged their superiority. Most who did this survived. The procession would sweep past, ignoring you, and you would be left standing in the road, shaking, unharmed, usually. Or you could watch. Stand and stare and witness the full glory of the Sheely court in procession. This was the foolish choice, the choice that almost always ended in disaster, because to watch was to invite attention, and the attention of the Sheely court was not something mortals could withstand. They would notice you, they would stop, and they would issue an invitation, join us. It was not a request, but it was not an order either. You had a choice. You always had a choice, because the Sheely court, bound by their codes, could not take you without your consent. They had to offer, you had to accept, and of course you would accept, because the offer came with enchantment, with glamour, with magic that made the very idea of refusing impossible. Your mind would fill with visions of beauty and wonder. Your heart would ache with longing. And you would step forward, onto the road, into the procession, and you would be gone. Some returned. Years later, decades later, unchanged by time, appearing on the same road at the same season. They would have no memory of where they had been, or they would have perfect memory but no ability to articulate it, speaking in fragments and contradictions, weeping, trying to describe a place that human language had no words for. Others were never seen again. This was the Sheely court, bound by honor, capable of generosity, breathtakingly beautiful, and absolutely, utterly, inhumanly dangerous. Now let us speak of their counterparts. Where the Sheely court had rules, the unsheely court had none. Where the blessed court might negotiate, the unholy court simply took. Where one might be survived through careful respect and adherence to protocol, the other could not be reasoned with, could not be appeased, could not be escaped. The unsheely court was ending riding through the night. They were winter-made manifest, cold and cruel and implacable. They were the fairies of nightmare, of madness, of spite and malice so pure it became a force of nature. They rode black horses with eyes like burning coals and breath like grave fog. They wore armor made from bones and crowns of thorns. Their faces were beautiful sometimes, hideous others, shifting between forms to maximize the terror of whoever looked upon them. And they hunted, not for food, not for territory. They hunted mortals for sport. The unsheely court's favorite pastime was the wild hunt, a thundering chase through the night sky, across moors and forests and sleeping villages, pursuing whatever caught their attention. Sometimes they hunted deer, sometimes wolves, sometimes criminals or oath-breakers, those who had violated sacred laws and therefore forfeited divine protection. And sometimes they hunted the innocent simply because they could. If you heard the wild hunt approaching, if you heard the baying of hounds that were not dogs and the thunder of hooves that were not horses and the horns that sounded like screaming, you had one option. Get inside. Immediately. Into your house. Into a church. Into any structure with a roof and walls and a door you could bar. And you prayed. Prayed that they would pass. Prayed that whatever they were hunting, it was not you. Because if you were caught outside when the wild hunt rode past, they would see you, and seeing you, they would add you to the hunt, not as a hunter, as the hunted. They would chase you, for hours, for days, across impossible distances. You would run until your lungs burned, and your legs gave out, and your heart hammered so hard you thought it would burst. And still, they would be behind you, always behind you, laughing, toying with you, letting you think you might escape before closing in again. When they caught you, and they always caught you, the end was not merciful. Sometimes they ended you, ripped apart by hounds, or trampled by hooves, or simply driven mad by terror until your heart stopped. Sometimes they took you with them, alive, dragged into their company, to run forever with the hunt, neither living nor deceased, enslaved to the chase for eternity. And sometimes, worst of all, they let you go, released you at dawn, when the hunt ended and the Unshili court returned to wherever they came from. You would find yourself miles from home, in some forest or moor you did not recognize, bruised and bleeding and half mad with exhaustion, and you would walk home and try to resume your life, but you could not, because you had run with the wild hunt. You had been hunted by the Unshili court, and that experience broke something in you that could never be repaired. You would hear the horns in your sleep, feel the terror in quiet moments, jump at shadows, and slowly, inevitably, you would waste away until your body finally caught up with what your mind had already known. You were already gone. You perished the night the hunt caught you. This life you were living was just a ghost's dream, a fading echo, nothing real. The Unshili court did not need reasons to harm you. They did not need provocations. You did not have to offend them, or break a rule, or violate some sacred prohibition. You simply had to exist. And that was enough. They delighted in cruelty. This was their nature. Where the Shili court might test you, the Unshili court tortured you. Where the blessed court operated by contract, however unfair, the unholy court did whatever they pleased, whenever they pleased, to whomever they pleased. You could not appease them with offerings. Iron did not repel them as reliably as it did other fairies. Holy water, crosses, prayers, these might slow them, might provide momentary protection, but the Unshili court was relentless. If they wanted you, truly wanted you, no protection would hold forever. Their signature weapon was the elf shot, an invisible arrow shot from nowhere that would strike without warning. You would feel a sudden sharp pain in your chest or back or head. No wound would be visible, but from that moment, you would begin to waste away. Food would lose its taste. Sleep would bring no rest. Your strength would fail, and no doctor, no healer, no medicine could cure you, because the elf shot was not a physical wound. It was a curse, a sentence of slow ending, delivered for no reason other than that the Unshili court found your continued existence annoying. Animals too could be struck by elf shot. A cow would suddenly stop giving milk. A horse would go lame. A sheep would sicken and perish. And the farmer, knowing what had happened, would have no recourse. The Unshili court had struck. Nothing could be done. There are recorded cases, from Scotland particularly, of people claiming to have been struck by elf shot. Sometimes the arrow could be found, a tiny flint arrowhead, ancient, embedded in clothing or flesh. These were kept as proof, shown to priests and doctors and neighbours, physical evidence that the old beliefs were real. Modern archaeology would call these Neolithic artifacts stone tools from thousands of years ago, misidentified. But to the people who found them, they were confirmation. The Unshili court was real, and they were hunting us. According to some traditions, there was once a war between the Shili and Unshili courts. A conflict so vast and terrible that it threatened to tear apart the very fabric of reality, to destroy not just the fairy realms, but the mortal world caught between them. And so, a treaty was made, brokered by powers unknown, older than the fairies themselves perhaps, or simply arising from mutual exhaustion and the recognition that neither side could win. The treaty divided the year, half to the Shili, half to the Unshili, summer to light, winter to dark. Beltane to Samhain belonged to the Blessed Court. Samhain to Beltane belonged to the Unholy Court. During their season, each court held dominion. During the Shili months from May to November, the world was warmer, brighter, more forgiving. Crops grew, animals thrived, humans prospered. The Unshili court was still present, still dangerous, but constrained, weaker, During the Unshi months, from November to May, the world was cold, harsh, potentially fatal. Winter storms ended lives, starvation was common, disease spread, and the Unshi court rode freely, hunting, tormenting, ending. The transition points, Beltane Eve and Samhain Eve, were when both courts were abroad, when the changing of power occurred. These were the most dangerous nights of the entire year, because both courts were active, both were powerful, and the usual rules, such as they were, did not apply. On these nights, you locked your doors and windows. You covered your hearth. You made the sign of the cross over every threshold. You did not look outside, no matter what sounds you heard, no matter what voices called your name, because on these nights, both courts rode together, not in cooperation, but in parallel. Two great processions, one of light and one of dark, sweeping through the mortal world, and woe to anyone caught between them. The treaty also supposedly included provisions about mortals, that humans were not to be taken without cause, that certain protections, certain sanctuaries would be honored by both courts, churches, crossroads, running water. But this was aspirational at best. The Shili court sometimes honored these protections. The Unshili court never did. And so humans lived in the space between two inhuman powers, trying desperately to navigate rules that were never clearly explained, that changed without warning, that could be violated without you knowing until the punishment came. This was life in the British Isles for thousands of years, not metaphorically. Actually, this was the world our ancestors inhabited, a world where the land itself was claimed by beings who tolerated human presence but did not welcome it, who could, at any moment, for any reason or no reason, decide to make you suffer. And the only defense was knowledge, passed down generation to generation, encoded in folklore and ritual and taboo, knowledge of where not to go, when not to venture out, how to show respect, what to say and what never to say, how to protect yourself and your family. This knowledge was not quaint, it was survival, and we forgot it. Chapter 3. Changelings. Of all the horrors attributed to fairies, none struck deeper terror into the hearts of parents than the changeling. The idea that your child, your infant, could be stolen in the night and replaced with something else. Something that looked like your baby, but was not. This was not metaphor. This was not symbolic. For centuries, across Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England, people believed this happened. They believed it absolutely, and they acted upon that belief in ways that, to our modern sensibilities, seem monstrous. But to understand the changeling, we must first comprehend why fairies wanted human children. The answer, recorded in countless folk tales, was always the same. Fairy children were weak, sickly. They lacked the vitality, the life force that human infants possessed. And so the fairies, who could take what they wanted, would creep into mortal homes and make an exchange. Your healthy, thriving baby for their frail, fading offspring. The substitution was said to happen most often in the first few weeks of life, before the child was baptized. Baptism, you see, placed the child under divine protection. But an unbaptized infant belonged to no one. It was spiritually vulnerable. Fair game. The fairies would wait until the mother was exhausted, sleeping deeply after childbirth. They would wait until the father was away, or drunk, or simply not paying attention. And then, in absolute silence, they would slip into the house, lift the infant from its cradle, and leave their own child in its place. When the mother woke, she would find her baby changed. Not obviously. The changeling would look like her child mostly. But something would be wrong. The baby would cry constantly, a thin, wailing sound that never stopped. It would refuse to eat, or eat ravenously but never grow. Its eyes would be wrong, too old, too knowing. It would watch you with an intelligence no infant should possess. Sometimes the changeling would not even bother to maintain the disguise. It would reveal itself, an ancient, wizened creature, with the face of a malevolent old being lying in the cradle where your baby should be, laughing at you. The folklore overflows with these accounts. Babies who thrived one day and were hollow-eyed and wasted the next. Children who could not walk at age 5, but were heard speaking perfect adult speech when they thought no one was listening. Infants who showed no affection, no recognition of their parents, only a cold, alien stare. And the worst part, the part that haunted every parent, was this: your real child was gone, taken into the fairy realm to be raised as one of them, or used, or simply discarded when the fairies tired of it. The question then became, what do you do when you discover a changeling in your home? The answer, according to folklore, was to make the changeling reveal itself, and perhaps, the fairies would return your real child in exchange. The methods were cruel. They had to be, because the test for a changeling required you to do something so shocking, so impossible to reconcile with normal infant care, that only a fairy in disguise would react. One method was to place the suspected changeling on a hot shovel or hold it near the fire. A real baby would cry, would be harmed, would suffer, but a changeling, so the logic went, would leap from the flames, fully grown, and flee up the chimney, cackling. Another method was to brew eggshells. You would take a dozen eggshell halves, fill them with water, and set them over the fire as if brewing a great feast. The changeling, unable to resist commenting on such absurdity, would speak, and speaking would reveal itself. There are recorded cases, documented cases from the 17th, 18th, even 19th centuries of parents doing these things, placing their children near fire, attempting to force reactions through shocking methods, all to force the fairy to reveal itself and return the real child. Sometimes, according to the folklore, it worked. The changeling would vanish in a puff of smoke, and the real child would be found on the doorstep the next morning, unharmed. But most of the time, it did not work. Most of the time, what you had was simply a sick child, or a child with developmental differences, or a child who was different in some way that the parents could not accept. And the belief in changelings gave them permission to treat that child harshly, believing they were fighting a fairy imposter. In 1895, in Clonmel, Ireland, a woman named Bridget Cleary met a tragic end at the hands of her husband and family. They held her near fire, demanding that the fairy return the real Bridget. She perished screaming that she was real, that she was herself. But her husband believed, absolutely, that she had been replaced. The changeling belief was not harmless folklore. It had real, horrific consequences. But here is the question that haunts me. Why did this belief persist for so long? Why, across centuries, across entire cultures, did people continue to believe that fairies stole children? The answer, I think, is grief and helplessness. Before modern medicine, infant mortality was staggering. Babies perished, all the time. From diseases we now prevent with vaccines, from infections we now cure with antibiotics, from conditions we now treat easily. But in those times, there was nothing parents could do. Their healthy child would sicken and waste and pass, and no one could explain why. The changeling gave them an explanation. It was not your fault. It was not divine will. It was the fairies. And if it was the fairies, then maybe, just maybe, your real child was still alive somewhere. Maybe you could get them back. It was a delusion, born of desperate hope. A way to make senseless tragedy make sense. But it was also a delusion that the folklore itself encouraged. Because every tale of changelings included the possibility of return, the cruel tests, the violent rituals, They always came with the promise, do this, and your child will come back. They never did. The real children, the ones who had passed or were simply different, were gone. And the changeling belief, rather than providing comfort, simply added another layer of horror to an already unbearable loss. This is the dark truth about fairy folklore. It was not just stories. It shaped behavior. It caused suffering. And it persisted because people needed it to be true, even when the cost was unspeakable. The changeling tales also reveal something else: the deep anxiety parents felt about their own children, the fear that their child was somehow wrong, different, not what they expected. In an era when conformity was survival, when a child who could not work, could not contribute, was a burden the family might not be able to bear, difference was terrifying. The changeling myth gave parents a way to externalize that fear. It is not my child who is wrong. It is a fairy imposter. My real child is perfect. Somewhere. But the tragedy is that the child in the cradle, the one being tested and tormented and sometimes harmed, was their real child. A child who needed care and understanding and medical attention they did not have access to. Instead, they received suspicion, cruelty, and sometimes violence, all because of a belief that something inhuman had invaded their home. The protections against changelings were extensive. You placed iron in the cradle. You hung a horseshoe above the door. You never left the baby alone in the first 40 days. You never praised the child's beauty or health, because that would attract fairy attention. Instead, you pretended the baby was sickly, unattractive, nothing worth stealing. You whispered prayers over the cradle. You made the sign of the cross on the infant's forehead every night. And above all, you baptized as soon as possible. Because once the child was baptized, once it belonged to the church, the fairies could not touch it. Or so people believed. But even this was not always enough. There are stories of fairies stealing baptized children, of changelings left in cradles despite every protection. Because if the fairies wanted your child, truly wanted them, there was nothing you could do. This helplessness, this inability to protect your own offspring, is at the heart of the changeling terror. Parents will do anything to keep their children safe. Anything. And when the threat is invisible, unpredictable, unstoppable, when no amount of vigilance or prayer or precaution can guarantee safety, the fear becomes overwhelming. It consumes you. It drives you to desperate measures. And the folklore understood this. The changeling tales are not really about fairies. They are about parental anxiety taken to its logical extreme. About the fear that you will fail to protect your child. That something will take them from you and there is nothing you can do to prevent it. That fear is universal. It crosses centuries and cultures. It is as real today as it was in medieval Ireland. The difference is that today we have different explanations for childhood illness and difference. We have medicine, psychology, genetics. We do not need fairies to explain why a child is sick, or why development is delayed, or why behavior is unusual. But the fear remains. The helplessness remains. And in some ways, the changeling tales speak to that fear more honestly than our modern medical language does. Because those tales admit what we often do not, that sometimes, despite everything you do, despite all your love and care and vigilance, bad things happen to children, and you cannot stop them. And it is not fair, and it is not your fault, but it still happens. The changeling myth gave parents someone to blame, the fairies, an external enemy, a malevolent force that could be fought, at least in theory. Better that than the unbearable truth, that sometimes children suffer and there is no reason, no enemy, no one to fight, just random, meaningless tragedy. We think we are more rational now, more enlightened. We do not believe in changelings, but we still seek explanations when children suffer. We still need someone or something to blame. Environmental toxins, vaccines, food additives, screen time. We create our own modern changelings, external forces that steal our perfect children and leave damaged ones in their place. The names change. The underlying need does not. We need to believe that there is a reason, that if we just avoid the right things, follow the right rules, our children will be safe. But life does not work that way. It never has. And the old fairy tales, for all their cruelty, at least admitted that fundamental truth. The world is dangerous. Children are vulnerable, and sometimes you cannot save them. This is the dark heart of the changeling legend. Not that fairies stole children, but that children could be lost, and parents, desperate and grieving and unable to accept that loss, would do terrible things to try to get them back, would harm the child they had in pursuit of the child they imagined, would choose a comforting lie over an unbearable truth. And we, with all our modern knowledge, with all our science and medicine and psychology, are not so different. We still tell ourselves stories to make sense of the senseless. We still need explanations, even when there are none. We still cling to hope, even when hope leads us to harm. The changelings are us, our fears made manifest, our grief given form. And until we can accept that some losses have no meaning, no purpose, no enemy to fight, we will keep creating them. In new forms, with new names, but serving the same desperate need. To believe that if we just do the right thing, say the right words, follow the right ritual, we can keep our children safe. But we cannot. We never could. And the fairy tales knew that, even if we have forgotten. Chapter 4. The Red Cap. Not all fairies bothered with tricks. Not all of them needed elaborate schemes or enchantments. Some were simply murderers, and among these, none was more dreaded than the Red Cap. The Red Cap, known in Scots dialect as the Red Cowp or Bloody Cap, was a creature of the Scottish borders. A squat, elderly-looking goblin, immensely strong despite his small stature, with long grey hair, bony fingers ending in talons, and eyes that burned with malice. He wore iron boots, carried a pike made of iron, and upon his head, a cap, dyed red with human blood. The Red Cap lived in the ruins that dotted the border country. Old castles, abandoned towers, sites where violence had occurred, battlefields, sites of historical conflict, places where blood had soaked the earth. These were his homes, and he had one requirement, one compulsion. His cap must never dry. To keep it wet, to keep it red, the Red Cap needed fresh blood, human blood, and he would end lives to get it. Travellers who sought shelter in ruined castles, not knowing what dwelt there, would hear the sound of iron boots, clank, 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 echoing through empty halls, growing closer. And then the Red Cap would appear, pike in hand, ready to strike. He was fast, impossibly fast. Those iron boots, which should have slowed him, somehow made him faster. You could not outrun him, and he was strong, strong enough to crush bones with his bare hands, to tear through armor, to overpower any opponent. The Folklore offers only 2 defenses against the Red Cap. The first, and most reliable, was to speak scripture, a passage from holy text, a prayer, anything invoking divine protection. The Red Cap, like many malevolent fairies, could not abide holy words. He would flee, shrieking, his eyes burning in their sockets. But you had to speak clearly, loudly, and with conviction. If fear made you stammer, if you forgot the words, if your voice failed, the Red Cap would strike. And once his pike pierced your flesh, once your blood began to flow, he would soak his cap in it, laughing. The second defense was iron, but not just any iron. You needed a weapon, a knife, a sword, something blessed or made with holy intent. Regular iron, the iron of horseshoes or nails, would slow him. But to truly harm a redcap required iron wielded with purpose, and few travellers carried such things. Most who encountered the redcap did not escape. The ruins of the border country were filled with bones, picked clean, scattered. The remains of those who sought shelter and found only ending, and the redcap would return to his dwelling, cap freshly soaked, and wait, patient, immortal, knowing that eventually someone else would come. What is particularly chilling about the redcap is his simplicity. He does not trick you. He does not make bargains. He does not pretend to be friendly or lure you with enchantments. He simply ends lives. Because he needs blood. Because his nature demands it. He is in essence a predator, territorial, methodical, unstoppable unless you know the specific, narrow ways to defend yourself. And the folklore treated him as such, not a misunderstood creature, not a being you could negotiate with, but a monster, a thing to be avoided at all costs. The redcap represents the most primal fear embedded in fairy folklore, that something inhuman shares our world, that it looks somewhat like us, but twisted, and that it wants us gone for reasons we cannot comprehend or prevent. There is no moral to the redcap's story, no lesson about respecting nature, or keeping promises, or being virtuous. There is only this: stay out of the ruins. Do not seek shelter where blood was spilled, because some places belong to things that were never human and never will be. And if you hear iron boots in the darkness, run, and pray your voice holds steady long enough to speak the words that might save you. The redcap's territory was specific, the debatable lands between Scotland and England, a region that for centuries knew constant warfare, where clans raided each other, where English and Scottish armies clashed, where blood soaked the ground so thoroughly that the earth itself seemed cursed. In such a place, the redcap made sense. He was the spirit of violence made flesh, the accumulated horror of centuries of conflict given form and purpose. Every ruined tower in the borders had seen ending. Every abandoned castle had witnessed atrocity. And the redcap was the memory of that violence, refusing to fade, demanding fresh tribute. The folklore is very clear on one point. You cannot reason with a redcap. You cannot appeal to mercy because he has none. You cannot offer him gold or food or anything else because the only thing he wants is blood. Your blood specifically, though he is not particular about whose blood he gets. Any human will do. This makes him different from many other fairy beings. The Sheely court could be bargained with. The unsheely court had patterns, even if those patterns were cruel. But the redcap is pure, focused violence, a force of nature in humanoid form, and the only way to survive him is to not encounter him in the first place. Which is why the folklore is so insistent. Do not shelter in ruins. Do not enter abandoned castles. Do not seek refuge in places of old violence. Because the redcap is waiting, always waiting, and he never sleeps. The iron boots deserve special mention. Iron is traditionally protective against fairies. They cannot bear its touch. It burns them, weakens them, drives them away. And yet the redcap wears iron boots, carries an iron pike. He has somehow overcome the one weakness that hampers his kind. This makes him uniquely dangerous. The protections that work against other fairies do not work against him. You cannot keep him at bay with a horseshoe or an iron nail. He is already armoured in the very substance that should repel him. This suggests something about the redcap's nature. He is not purely fairy. He is something else. Something that has taken fairy form but is not bound by fairy limitations. Perhaps he is, as some traditions suggest, the ghost of a particularly vicious warrior. Someone so steeped in violence during life that ending could not contain them. They became something other, something worse, bound to the place of their crimes, doomed to repeat them eternally. Or perhaps he is older still, a pre-Christian deity of war and blood, diminished like the other old gods, but refusing to fade entirely, clinging to existence through violence, feeding on ending the way other fairies feed on milk or cream. Whatever his origin, the redcap serves a function in the folklore ecology. He makes certain places forbidden. He guards the ruins, not to protect them, but to claim them, to ensure that the sites of old violence remain violent, that blood-soaked ground stays cursed. He is a warning made flesh. This is what happens when humans forget the cost of war, when violence is normalized, when blood becomes commonplace, when ending life is just another day's work. The redcap is born, and once born, he cannot be unkilled. He can only be avoided. The few recorded encounters with redcaps that ended in survival all follow the same pattern. Someone enters a ruin. They hear the iron boots. They realize with dawning horror what they have awakened, and they speak the words. Scripture, prayer, invocation. The redcap flees. The person escapes, barely, and they never, ever go back. These survivors become the source of the tales. They warn others. They tell their children and grandchildren. They mark certain ruins on maps with symbols that mean danger, ending, do not enter. And slowly, over generations, the knowledge spreads. This place is forbidden, not because the church says so, though the church might agree, but because something lives there, something that will end you if you give it the chance. This is oral tradition at its most functional. Knowledge encoded in story, passed down through warning, kept alive because forgetting means ending. The redcap tales are not entertainment. They are survival information. And they worked. For centuries, people avoided the ruins. They did not shelter there, even in the worst weather. They did not explore them out of curiosity. They did not let their children play among the stones, because the redcap was waiting, and everyone knew it. This knowledge has been lost. The ruins are tourist attractions now, historical sites. People wander through them freely, taking photographs, having picnics, letting their children climb the old walls. And nothing happens. No iron boots echo. No wizened creature appears with a bloody pike. The redcap, if he ever existed, is gone. Or perhaps he is simply sleeping. Waiting. Because the one thing the folklore is very clear about is this. The redcap is patient, immortal, and he never forgets. So if you find yourself in the Scottish borders, exploring an old tower or abandoned castle, and you hear a sound like iron boots on stone, remember, speak the words. Any prayer will do. Speak them clearly, speak them loudly, and then run. Because some warnings should never be forgotten, even if we no longer believe in the things we were warned about. Chapter 5. Banshees and Kelpies. Ireland and Scotland are home to fairy beings that have become famous, or perhaps infamous, even in modern times. The Banshee and the Kelpie. But their popular representations, the images we carry of them today, are sanitized, simplified, made safe. The real folklore is far darker and far more complex. Let us begin with the Banshee, the Beanshee in Irish meaning woman of the fairy mound. She is, in popular imagination, a wailing ghost who appears to foretell demise. A figure in white, keening outside the window, warning that someone in the household will soon pass. This is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. The Banshee was not just any spirit. She was specifically attached to certain families. Old Irish families, noble bloodlines, the descendants of the ancient clans. Each family had their own Banshee, a guardian of sorts, who had been with them for generations. And when someone of that bloodline was about to perish, she would appear, not to cause the ending, but to mourn it. Her cry was called the keening, a sound like nothing else in the world, not quite human, not quite animal, a wail of pure grief that cut through the night air and chilled the blood of anyone who heard it. Those who heard the banshee's cry knew with absolute certainty that someone was going to be gone, soon, within hours or days. The banshee did not specify who. She simply mourned, and then she was gone, and the family would wait, dreading, knowing, until the news came. A sudden illness, an accident, a passing in sleep. Someone was gone, just as the banshee had foretold. This was not malicious. The banshee was not ending these people. She was simply aware, in some otherworldly way, that their time had come, and her nature compelled her to mourn. Some families considered her a curse, a herald of doom, but others saw her differently, as a protector, a link to their ancestors, a reminder that they were of old blood, important enough that even the otherworld took notice of their passing. There are accounts of people seeing the banshee. She is most often described as a woman in white or grey, with long hair that she combs with a silver comb. Sometimes she is young and beautiful. Sometimes she is ancient and wizened. Sometimes she is washing bloody clothes in a stream, the clothes of the person about to perish. And sometimes she is simply standing at the edge of the property, keening, her face a mask of sorrow. To see her was terrifying, but to hear her and not see her was worse, because then you knew someone would pass, but you did not know who. Was it you, your spouse, your child, your parent? The uncertainty was agony. Some tried to prevent the foretold ending. They kept the sick person under constant watch. They forbade anyone from traveling. They took every precaution, but it never worked. When the banshee cried, someone passed, always. The question was only who and when. The banshee appears in Irish folklore as far back as records go. She is mentioned in medieval texts. She is referenced in genealogies. She is part of the cultural landscape in a way that makes her almost more than folklore. She is history. Families kept records of banshee sightings, noted them in journals and letters, treated them as matter of fact, not superstition, not myth, simply reality. And this continued into modern times. There are accounts from the 19th century, even the early 20th, of people hearing the banshee, of her cry being noted in newspapers, correlated with subsequent passings, of communities that took her presence seriously, that altered behavior based on her warnings. This is not ancient, primitive belief. This is living tradition, persisting into an era of telegraphs and trains and scientific rationalism. Why? Why did people continue to believe in the banshee when so much other folklore had faded? Perhaps because she was useful, not in preventing ending, but in preparing for it. In an era when medical care was primitive and unexpected, passing was common, the banshee gave families warning, time to gather, time to say goodbye, time to prepare, emotionally and practically, for loss. Her cry was a kindness in its way, a chance to brace yourself before the blow fell. Or perhaps people believed because the banshee was right. Time and time again, her cry was followed by ending. And even the most rational person confronted with that pattern might begin to wonder, is it coincidence? Or is there something here we do not understand? Something real, even if we cannot explain it? The banshee is still reported today. In Ireland, in the Irish diaspora, in places where old families remember old traditions. The accounts are quieter now, less public. People are embarrassed to admit they believe in such things, but in private, in hushed conversations, the stories continue. Someone heard her last week. Someone's grandmother saw her before her husband passed. Someone knows someone who knows someone who heard the cry. And perhaps it is all coincidence. Perhaps it is grief and pattern seeking and the human need to find meaning in tragedy. Or perhaps the banshee is real, still keening, still mourning, still watching over the old families, even as the modern world forgets she exists. I cannot tell you which is true. I can only tell you what the folklore says. And what the folklore says is this: if you hear a woman crying in the night and you are of Irish blood and the sound chills you to your core, do not investigate. Go inside, be with your family, and wait, because the banshee has come and someone will soon be gone. Now let us turn to the Kelpie. Where the banshee is a mourner, the Kelpie is a murderer, a shape-shifting water spirit that haunts the lochs and rivers of Scotland. Specifically, the Kelpie appears as a horse, a beautiful horse, standing near water, seemingly lost or abandoned. Its coat gleams. Its eyes are gentle. It appears tame, approachable. And that is the trap. Because if you touch the Kelpie, if you try to pet it or mount it, your hand will stick, frozen to its hide by some otherworldly adhesive. And once you are stuck, the Kelpie will move. It will plunge into the water, dragging you with it, down into the depths, and there it will drown you and consume you, all but your liver and heart, which will float to the surface as proof of what happened. This is not a rare occurrence in the folklore. This is what Kelpies do. It is their nature. They are predators, and humans are their prey. They do not do this out of malice, any more than a crocodile acts out of malice. They are simply following their nature, which happens to be lethal. The warning against Kelpies was drummed into Scottish children from the youngest age. Do not approach strange horses near water. Do not touch them. Do not mount them, no matter how beautiful, how gentle, how perfect they seem, because they are not horses, they are Kelpies, and they will end you. And yet, people still perished, because the Kelpie's disguise was perfect, and because humans are curious and arrogant and convinced that warnings apply to other people, not to them. There are recorded cases of bodies being found in lochs with the telltale signs. Organs missing, evidence of drowning. No explanation for how they got into the water, because they were experienced swimmers, because the weather was calm, because there was no reason for them to have gone into the loch in the first place, unless there was a Kelpie. Then it made perfect sense. The Kelpie could take other forms besides a horse. Sometimes it appeared as a handsome young man, standing by the water, asking for help. Sometimes it appeared as a beautiful woman, beckoning. Sometimes it was an old person who seemed lost and confused. But the horse was its preferred form, perhaps because horses were valuable, and seeing one running loose was tempting. Perhaps because mounting a horse was a natural automatic action, perhaps simply because it worked. The Kelpie's domain was water, any water, lochs, rivers, even small streams. Wherever there was water deep enough to drown in, a Kelpie might dwell. And they were territorial. Once a Kelpie claimed a particular body of water, it stayed there. For years, for decades, for centuries, accumulating victims, becoming part of the local landscape, part of the local warning system. Do not go to that loch. A Kelpie lives there. Do not water your horse at that river. Do not let your children play by that stream. The warnings were specific, geographic, passed down through generations, and they saved lives, because people who heeded the warnings avoided those places, found other sources of water, took longer routes to avoid dangerous crossings. But there were always those who did not heed the warnings, who thought they knew better, who were in a hurry, or desperate, or simply unlucky, and the Kelpie got them. There are a few stories of people who escaped a Kelpie. These stories follow a pattern. Someone touches the Kelpie and realizes, too late, what it is. Their hand is stuck. The Kelpie is moving toward the water, and in desperation, the person does something drastic. They cut off their own hand, or they call on divine intervention, or they speak the Kelpie's true name, which somehow breaks the enchantment, and they escape, maimed, traumatized, but alive. And they become the source of the warning, the living proof that the Kelpie is real, that the old stories are not mere superstition, that the danger is genuine. These survivors never went near water again, not if they could help it. They had looked into the eyes of something inhuman and predatory. They had felt its strength, its hunger, and they knew that next time they would not be so lucky. The Banshee and the Kelpie represent two different aspects of fairy danger. The Banshee is inevitable, unavoidable. You cannot negotiate with ending. You cannot stop it. All you can do is prepare. All you can do is mourn. The Banshee embodies that inexorable aspect of fate. She is not malicious. She is simply there, witnessing, keening, reminding us that all lives end. The Kelpie, by contrast, is avoidable. Do not approach strange horses near water. Simple. Follow that rule and you live. Break it and you perish. The Kelpie embodies the consequences of ignoring warnings, of thinking you are special, exempt, smarter than those who came before. The Kelpie punishes arrogance. And unlike the Banshee, the Kelpie can be prevented. The danger is real, but it is also predictable, and therefore, in theory, survivable. Both serve educational functions. The Banshee teaches acceptance. The Kelpie teaches caution. Together, they form a complete picture of how our ancestors understood danger. Some threats you cannot control. You can only endure them with grace. Other threats you can avoid if you are smart enough to listen to those who know better than you. This is wisdom, encoded in supernatural beings, made memorable through fear, passed down through story. And it worked. For centuries it worked. People learned to live with the Banshee, to accept her warnings, to prepare for loss, to mourn with dignity. And people learned to avoid the Kelpie, to stay away from dangerous waters, to distrust beautiful horses in strange places, to value caution over curiosity. These lessons saved lives. And the fact that they came wrapped in tales of fairies and spirits and supernatural beings did not make them less valuable. It made them more so. Because stories stick. Stories are remembered. Stories are passed down. A parent telling a child to stay away from deep water is easily ignored. A parent telling a child about the Kelpie, about the beautiful horse that drowned dozens of people, about the organs that float to the surface, creates a visceral, memorable fear, and that fear keeps the child alive. This is why fairy folklore persists. Not because people are primitive or superstitious, but because it works. Because encoding practical knowledge in supernatural narrative is effective pedagogy. Because fear, properly applied, is protective. We have lost this. We tell our children to be careful around water, but we do not tell them about the Kelpie. We warn them about stranger danger, but we do not tell them that some strangers are not human at all. We try to teach through reason and explanation, and we wonder why it does not work, why children still drown, why they still trust the wrong people, why they still take foolish risks. Perhaps we should bring back the Kelpie, not as literal belief, but as story, as warning, as the visceral, memorable fear that keeps people alive. Because the Kelpie is not real, but drowning is. And anything that prevents drowning, even a story about a shape-shifting horse monster, is worth preserving. The same with the Banshee. She is not real, but ending is, and grief is, and the human need to prepare for loss, to have warning, to be able to say goodbye, that is real. The Banshee gave people that, a framework for anticipating and processing ending, a cultural ritual that made tragedy bearable. We have lost that too. We treat ending as a surprise, an interruption, a failure of medicine or fate. And we are not prepared. We do not know how to mourn. We do not know how to say goodbye. Perhaps the banshee could teach us, not as supernatural being, but as cultural practice, as reminder that ending comes, that we should be ready, that mourning is necessary and important, and deserves its own space, its own ritual, its own time. This is what we lost when we dismissed fairy folklore as primitive superstition. We lost practical knowledge. We lost effective pedagogy. We lost cultural practices that helped people survive and cope with a dangerous, unpredictable world, and we have not replaced them with anything better. We have science, yes. We have medicine. We have rational explanations, but we do not have stories. We do not have warnings that stick. We do not have rituals that help. And so we drown, literally and metaphorically, because we forgot about the Kelpie. We forgot about the banshee. We forgot that our ancestors were not fools, that their stories were not nonsense, that the supernatural wrapping was not the point. The point was survival. The point was wisdom. The point was passing down knowledge in a form that would be remembered and acted upon. The fairies were never real, but the dangers they represented were, and the stories kept us safe, until we stopped believing. And now we are vulnerable. Again. Chapter 6. Puck and the English Fae. England has its own fairy traditions, distinct from the Celtic folklore of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. The English fairies are smaller, more domestic, more closely tied to human habitation. They live in houses and barns as much as in forests and hills. They interact with humans more frequently, if not always more kindly. And the most famous of these English fairies is Puck. You know Puck, perhaps, from Shakespeare. From A Midsummer Night's Dream, where he appears as a mischievous sprite, playing pranks on lovers, turning Bottom into a donkey, generally causing chaos for his own amusement. This is Puck filtered through Elizabethan theatre, sanitized, made entertaining, made safe. The real Puck, the one who appears in English folklore for centuries before Shakespeare got to him, was darker, more dangerous, more genuinely frightening. Puck, also known as Robin Goodfellow, was a house spirit. He lived, according to the folklore, in the spaces between human and wild, in barns and stables, in the woods just beyond the village, in the fields at twilight, and he was a shapeshifter. Sometimes he appeared as a young man, handsome and charming. Sometimes as an old man, wizened and bent. Sometimes as an animal, a horse or a dog or a goat. And sometimes he was invisible, present only as a voice in the darkness, or a hand that pushed you when no one was there. Puck's defining characteristic was mischief. He played pranks, constantly, endlessly. Some of his pranks were harmless. He would sweep the hearth for a housewife who left him a bowl of cream. He would help with chores if properly propitiated. He might even warn of danger, guide lost travelers home, protect children who wandered too far from safety, but cross him, offend him, or simply catch him in a bad mood, and his pranks turned cruel. He would lead travelers in circles through the woods until they were hopelessly lost. This was called being Puck-led, or pixie-led in some regions. You would walk for hours, certain you were heading home, only to find yourself back where you started, or worse, miles in the wrong direction, exhausted, disoriented, with night falling, and no idea where you were. The only way to break the enchantment was to turn your coat inside out. This apparently confused Puck enough that he would release you, or you could sit down and refuse to move, wait until dawn. Puck could not maintain his hold in daylight. He would sour milk, curdle cheese, make bread refuse to rise. Simple domestic disasters, But in an era when food was precious and waste could mean starvation, these were not merely annoying. They were dangerous. Housewives learned to leave offerings: cream, bread, a spot of ale. If Puck was pleased, he would help. If not, he would sabotage, and you never knew which it would be. He would pinch people in their sleep. You would wake covered in bruises, with no memory of how they got there. He would pull covers off beds, open windows in winter, let the fire go out. He would hide things. Keys, tools, anything you needed urgently would vanish, only to reappear days later in an obvious place you'd already checked a dozen times. He was, in short, infuriating. A constant low-level harassment that could, at any moment, escalate into real danger. There are stories of Puck pushing people into rivers, of leading them to cliff edges in the dark, of causing accidents that resulted in injury or even ending. These are not the actions of a cute, harmless sprite. These are the actions of a being who does not value human life, who sees us as toys, and who will casually destroy us if it amuses him. Puck was also associated with sexuality in uncomfortable ways. There are accounts, particularly from medieval sources, of Puck as an incubus figure, visiting women in the night, fathering children who were born different, strange, marked by their otherworldly heritage. These stories are deeply uncomfortable to modern readers. They speak to fears of violation, of pregnancy from unknown sources, of children who did not belong, but they were taken seriously. Women who became pregnant outside of marriage sometimes claimed Puck had visited them, not as an excuse necessarily, but as explanation. And communities sometimes accepted this, because Puck was real. Everyone knew he was real. And if he could lead you astray in the woods, why could he not do other things as well? The protections against Puck were the same as against other fairies. Iron, rowan, turning your clothes inside out, running water, church bells. But Puck was clever, more clever than most fairies. He learned to anticipate protections, to work around them, to find loopholes. If you hung a horseshoe above your door, he would enter through the window. If you wore iron, he would simply not manifest physically, but still cause mischief through invisible means. If you relied on church bells, he would wait until they stopped ringing. He was patient, persistent, and he never forgot an insult. There are stories of Puck tormenting a family for generations because some ancestor offended him. The grudge would pass down, father to son, mother to daughter. The family would know they were cursed, would know why, but would be powerless to end it, because Puck was immortal and humans were not. The only way to appease him was through consistent propitiation. Leave offerings every night. Never speak ill of him. Never mock the fairy folk. Treat every stranger with respect, because any stranger might be Puck in disguise. And hope that eventually he would grow bored and move on to torment someone else. Puck represents a particular type of fairy danger, not the grand dramatic danger of the wild hunt or the redcap, but the constant, wearing danger of living alongside something that does not play by human rules, something that can, at any moment, for any reason, make your life miserable. And you cannot fight it, you cannot negotiate with it, you can only endure it, and try to stay on its good side, which is exhausting and uncertain, and deeply, profoundly unfair. This is what daily life was like in rural England for centuries. Not constant terror, but constant vigilance. Always aware that something was watching. Always careful not to offend. Always leaving offerings, performing rituals, following rules that made no sense but had to be followed anyway. Because if you did not, Puck would notice, and Puck would make you pay. The gradual disappearance of Puck from English folklore is tied to industrialization and urbanization. As people moved to cities, as the old countryside was abandoned, as electric lights replaced candles and science replaced superstition, Puck faded. Not because people stopped believing in him, necessarily, but because the conditions that made Puck relevant no longer existed. If you do not rely on your bread rising, if your milk comes from a store rather than a cow, if you navigate by street signs rather than forest paths, then Puck's pranks lose their power. He cannot hurt you if you are not vulnerable. And modern life, for all its problems, makes us less vulnerable to the specific dangers Puck represented. But something was lost in that transition. Because Puck, like all fairy folklore, was not just about supernatural beings. He was about acknowledging limits, about recognizing that you are not in complete control, that there are forces, whether you call them fairies or chance or fate, that can disrupt your plans and upset your life, and learning to live with that uncertainty, learning to be flexible, to adapt, to find ways to cope when things go wrong for no reason. Puck taught that through fear and frustration and constant low-level harassment. Yes, but he taught it. And we, in our modern world, where we expect everything to work, where we demand explanations for every misfortune, where we sue when our coffee is too hot, have forgotten that lesson. We have forgotten how to live with uncertainty, how to accept that sometimes things just go wrong, that sometimes there is no one to blame, that sometimes you just have to laugh and turn your coat inside out and try again. Puck would appreciate that, I think. The laughter, the resilience, the refusal to take yourself too seriously. Because that is what he demanded in the end. Not worship, not fear, just acknowledgement. That you are small and the world is strange and sometimes a mischievous spirit is going to make your bread refuse to rise. And there is nothing you can do about it except leave him some cream and hope he is in a better mood tomorrow. Chapter 7. Leprechauns and Household Spirits. Ireland has given the world many fairy traditions, but perhaps none as famous or as misunderstood as the leprechaun. Today the leprechaun is a cartoon, a mascot for breakfast cereal, a symbol of Irish heritage reduced to a jolly little man in green, guarding a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow. This is not what the leprechaun was. The original leprechaun, the lamplight in Irish, was a solitary fairy, a cobbler, old, wizened, often drunk and deeply unpleasant. He lived alone, in isolated places, and he wanted nothing to do with humans. The leprechaun was wealthy. This part of the legend is true. He had gold, lots of it, accumulated over centuries of work, hidden away in secret places. And if you could catch him, if you could hold him and not let go, he would have to bargain with you. 3 wishes, or his pot of gold, in exchange for his freedom. But catching a leprechaun was nearly impossible. He was fast, he was clever, and he was a master of distraction. The folklore is filled with stories of people who caught a leprechaun, who held him tight, who demanded his gold, and the leprechaun would agree. Of course he would agree. He would point to a specific tree, or a rock, or a spot in the field and say the gold is buried there. And then he would say, "Look, a fox," or "Your house is on fire," or "Your mother is calling you," and the person would look. Just for a second, just a glance, and the leprechaun would be gone, vanished, and the person would be left with nothing. Because you cannot look away from a leprechaun, not for a second, not for any reason. The moment you break eye contact, he escapes. And even if you manage to keep looking, even if you get him to show you where the gold is buried, there is still a problem. Because leprechauns are tricksters. The gold might be real, but it might also be enchanted. You dig it up, carry it home, and by morning it has turned to leaves, or stones, or ashes, or worse, the gold is real but cursed. It brings misfortune. Your crops fail. Your animals sicken. Your family turns against you. everything you touch goes wrong, and you cannot get rid of the gold. You cannot give it back, because the leprechaun is gone, and even if you could find him, he would not take it back. This is the true nature of leprechaun folklore, not jolly, not lucky, but cautionary, a warning against greed, against trying to get something for nothing, against thinking you can outwit beings who have been playing these games for millennia. The leprechaun was a loner. Unlike the Sheely and unsheely courts, unlike Puck and the household spirits, the leprechaun wanted nothing to do with humans or other fairies. He lived alone. He worked alone. He hoarded his wealth alone. And he was bitter about it, angry, resentful of humans who disturbed his solitude, who demanded his gold, who thought they had a right to what he had earned. This bitterness made him dangerous, not in the dramatic way of the redcap or the kelpie, but in the subtle way of curses and bad luck and misfortune that followed you for the rest of your life. The best thing you could do if you encountered a leprechaun was leave him alone. Do not try to catch him. Do not demand his gold. Just nod politely and walk away. But humans, being human, rarely did this. The temptation of easy wealth was too great, and so they tried, and they failed, and they learned too late that some treasures are not worth the cost. Alongside the leprechaun, Ireland and Britain were home to dozens of household spirits, beings that lived alongside humans in houses and barns, helping or hindering depending on how they were treated. The brownie of Scotland was perhaps the most helpful, a small, brown-skinned creature who would do chores at night while the family slept, sweeping, cleaning, mending, churning butter. All he asked in return was a bowl of cream or porridge left out for him. But you had to be careful. You could not pay the brownie. You could not give him gifts beyond the simple offering of food, because if you did, if you gave him clothes or money or anything of value, he would take offense and leave, forever. There are stories of well-meaning housewives who, grateful for the brownie's help, left out a new set of clothes for him, a shirt and trousers, carefully made. And the next morning, the brownie was gone, the chores left undone, the house feeling empty and cold, because the brownie interpreted the gift as payment, and payment implied he was a servant. And he was not a servant, he was a helper. There is a difference. And the brownie would not tolerate being treated as lesser. The boggart was the brownie's evil twin, same size, same appearance, but malicious. Where the brownie helped, the boggart hindered. It would spoil food, break tools, make animals sick, terrify children. And unlike the brownie, you could not appease a boggart. Once it attached itself to your household, you were stuck with it. The only solution was to move. Pack up everything, leave the house, start over somewhere else, and hope the boggart did not follow. But often, it did follow. There are stories of families fleeing boggart infestations, only to hear a voice from the moving cart. "Are we moving then?" And they would know. The boggart had come with them, and there was no escape. The hob was another household spirit, particularly common in northern England. Similar to the brownie, but more temperamental. The hob would help with farm work, but only if treated with perfect respect. Any insult, any mockery, any failure to leave proper offerings, and the hob would turn malicious. A helpful hob could make a farm prosper. An angry hob could destroy it. Overnight, seemingly. Crops would wither, animals would sicken, tools would break. Buildings would fall into disrepair, and the family would know. We offended the hob, and now we are paying for it. These household spirits represent a particular worldview. The idea that you share your space with invisible beings. That your home is not entirely yours. That you must show respect, maintain boundaries, perform the proper rituals, or face consequences. This is exhausting, but it is also, in a strange way, comforting, because it means you are not alone. There is something else in the house with you, watching over you if you treat it right, helping you, protecting you from worse things. And in an era when life was hard, when infant mortality was high, when disease and starvation were constant threats, having an invisible protector, even one as temperamental as a hob or as easily offended as a brownie, was worth the effort. The offerings were small: a bowl of cream, some porridge, a crust of bread. Nothing that would bankrupt a family, but enough to show respect, enough to maintain the relationship, and in return, the work got done. The farm prospered. The children were safe. Not always, not guaranteed, but more often than if you were entirely alone. This is the practical magic of folklore. It provides psychological comfort, a sense of agency in an uncontrollable world. You cannot stop disease. You cannot prevent accidents, but you can leave offerings for the brownie. You can avoid offending the hob. You can perform the rituals that might, just might, tip the odds in your favor. And sometimes that is enough. Sometimes the ritual itself is the protection, not because it summons supernatural aid, but because it gives you something to do, some measure of control, some way to participate in your own survival. The household spirits understood this. They demanded rituals not because they needed the cream or the porridge, but because the ritual mattered. The act of remembering, the act of showing respect, the act of acknowledging that you are not the center of the universe. And when we stopped performing those rituals, when we stopped believing in household spirits, we lost something. Not the spirits themselves, which likely never existed, but the mindset they represented, the humility, the acknowledgement of limits, the understanding that sometimes you need help, even if that help comes from something you cannot see or understand. We are very alone now in our modern houses. No brownies, no hobs, no invisible helpers watching over us while we sleep. Just us, and our appliances, and our certainty that we are in control. But are we? Are we really? Or have we just convinced ourselves that we are, because the alternative is too frightening to contemplate? The household spirits knew the truth. You are not in control. You never were. But if you are kind, if you are respectful, if you leave a bowl of cream by the hearth, maybe, just maybe, something will help you anyway. Not because you deserve it, not because you earned it, but because kindness matters, and respect matters, and the rituals we perform, even the ones that seem silly, create connections between us and the world, between us and each other, between us and whatever invisible forces govern our lives. The leprechaun and the household spirits are gone now. We do not believe in them anymore. We do not leave offerings. We do not perform the rituals, and our houses are emptier for it. Not of furniture or possessions, but of meaning, of connection, of the sense that we are part of something larger than ourselves. We gained control, or the illusion of control, but we lost magic, and I am not sure it was a fair trade. Chapter 8. The Victorian Sanitization. Something changed in the 19th century. The fairies, who had terrorized the British Isles for millennia, who had stolen children and drowned travelers and demanded blood tribute, suddenly became small and cute and harmless. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate cultural project, a systematic rewriting of folklore to suit the sensibilities of an industrializing society that no longer had room for the genuinely strange and terrifying. The Victorians did this, and in doing so, we lost something irreplaceable. Let me show you how it happened. In the early 1800s, fairy folklore was still dark. The collections of folk tales published by researchers, the accounts given by rural people, the stories grandmothers told children, these were still the old stories, dangerous, frightening, full of real consequences. But as the century progressed, as Britain industrialized and urbanized, as more people moved to cities and left the old countryside behind, fairy tales began to change. The first shift was literary. Writers like the Brothers Grimm in Germany, and later Andrew Lang in Britain, began collecting and publishing fairy tales, but they sanitized them for middle-class audiences. The truly dark elements, the ones that might disturb delicate sensibilities, were softened or removed entirely. Changelings became mischievous imps, not child stealers. Fairies became helpful if you were kind rather than dangerous, no matter what you did. The Red Cap and creatures like him were simply not included. Too violent, too irredeemable. This was justified as making the stories suitable for children, but in doing so, it fundamentally altered what fairies were. They stopped being creatures of folklore, embedded in real cultural belief, and became characters in children's literature. Fictional, safe, educational. The second shift was visual. Victorian illustrators, particularly in the mid to late 1800s, began depicting fairies in a very specific way. Tiny, delicate, winged, beautiful, often female, often unclothed or nearly so, in a way that was meant to evoke innocence rather than anything else, though the line was always uncomfortably blurred. Artists like Richard Dadd, John Anster Fitzgerald and Arthur Rackham created images of fairies that were whimsical, detailed, and utterly divorced from the folklore tradition. These fairies danced on flowers, they wore acorn caps, they attended tiny fairy balls in moonlit glades. They were decorative, aesthetic, pretty, and these images became the dominant visual representation of fairies. They were reproduced on postcards, in children's books, on decorative plates and wall hangings. An entire industry grew around this sanitized fairy aesthetic. The folklore, the real folklore, with its terror and its teeth, was forgotten. The third shift was theatrical. In the early 20th century, stage productions began featuring fairies as benevolent helpers. The most famous example is from a 1904 play that introduced a fairy who was explicitly helpful, who spread pixie dust, who enabled children to fly. She was sassy, yes, temperamental, but ultimately good. This character became, for generations of children, the definitive fairy, and everything that came after built on that foundation. Fairy godmothers granting wishes, tooth fairies leaving money, garden fairies helping flowers grow. The Victorian project of sanitization was complete. Fairies were no longer beings of folklore. They were corporate mascots. But why? Why did this happen? Why did an entire culture decide to rewrite its own mythology? I believe there are several reasons. First, industrialization made the old beliefs inconvenient. If you are building railways and factories, if you are draining swamps and clearing forests, if you are reshaping the landscape itself, you cannot afford to believe that cutting down a hawthorn tree will bring a curse. You cannot afford to believe that certain places are forbidden, that certain beings must be appeased. The fairies had to become harmless, or they had to disappear. And since the stories were too embedded in culture to disappear entirely, they were transformed instead. Second, the Victorian era was obsessed with childhood innocence. Children were seen as pure, uncorrupted, in need of protection from the harsh realities of the world. Telling children stories about baby-stealing fairies, or murderous redcaps, or the unsheely caught hunting mortals for sport, did not fit this vision. So the stories were rewritten to teach moral lessons. Be kind, and fairies will help you. Be cruel, and they will punish you. Simple, didactic, safe. Third, there was a genuine loss of belief. By the late 1800s, most educated people no longer believed fairies were real. They were folklore, superstition, quaint rural beliefs that the modern world had outgrown. And if fairies are not real, If they are just stories, then why not make them pleasant stories? Why frighten children with tales of child theft and drowning when you could enchant them with tales of magic and wonder? The logic is understandable, but the cost was high. Because in sanitizing the fairies, the Victorians also sanitized away the function that fairy folklore had served for centuries. It had been a way to explain the inexplicable, to cope with child mortality, with sudden ending, with the dangers of the natural world. It had been a cultural repository for fear and awe, and the knowledge that humans are not in control. Chapter 9. What we lost. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the dark truth about fairies, and I want to leave you with a question. What did we lose when we forgot what fairies really were? On the surface, the answer seems obvious. We lost dangerous superstitions. We lost beliefs that led to harm and fear and irrational behavior. We gained rationality, science, the ability to explain the world without resorting to supernatural entities. This is progress, unquestionably. But I think we also lost something else, something harder to articulate, but no less real. We lost the sense that the world is bigger than we are, that there are places and times and beings that do not belong to us, that we are not the only intelligence, the only importance, the only story being told. The old fairy folklore said, "You are small. The world is vast and strange. There are rules you must follow, even if you do not understand them. There are places you must not go. There are times when you must be silent and watchful and humble." Modern rationality says, "You are in control. The world is yours to use. There are no rules except the ones you make. There are no forbidden places, only resources waiting to be exploited." One of these worldviews leads to environmental collapse. The other led to sustainable relationships with the land for thousands of years. I am not suggesting we should literally believe in fairies again. I am not saying we should start leaving offerings at hawthorn trees, or fear the Unshi court, or test our children for changeling signs. But I am saying that the erasure of fairy folklore, the sanitization of it into cute, harmless entertainment, represents a broader cultural loss. We lost the language for talking about limits, about humility, about the fact that we are part of an ecosystem, not its masters. The fairies in folklore were the voice of the land itself. They said, "This place is not yours. This tree is sacred. This water is protected. Violate these boundaries and there will be consequences." And people listened, not because they were primitive or superstitious, but because they understood something we have forgotten, that ignoring limits has a cost. Today we cut down entire forests, we drain wetlands, we poison rivers. And when the consequences come, when ecosystems collapse and climates shift and biodiversity disappears, we act surprised. Our ancestors would not have been surprised. They would have said, "You angered the fairies, you violated the sacred, and now you pay the price." Different language, same reality. So what is the dark truth about fairies? It is this: they were never real, but they were never just stories either. They were a way of encoding ecological knowledge, a way of teaching respect for nature, for boundaries, for forces beyond human control. A way of saying, some things are not for you. Some places are not yours to take. Some rules are not yours to break. And when we made them cute, when we made them safe, when we turned them into breakfast cereal mascots and children's entertainment, we lost that language. We lost the ability to say, "This is sacred, and you may not touch it." We lost the sense that the world might have its own agency, its own will, its own right to exist, separate from human use. And we lost the understanding that violating these principles has consequences, real, terrible, inescapable consequences. The fairies were the last cultural guardians of that understanding, and we eliminated them. We made them harmless, we made them ours. And now, when we need that language most, when we need a way to talk about limits and consequences and the rights of the non-human world, we have nothing. Nothing but science, which tells us what is happening, but cannot tell us why it matters. Cannot give us the moral weight, the cultural force, the deep, visceral understanding that some boundaries must not be crossed. The old stories could do that. They did do that for thousands of years, but we thought we were too smart for stories, too modern for folklore, too rational for fairies. And now we live in a world where nothing is sacred, where every forest is just timber waiting to be cut, where every river is just water waiting to be dammed, where every creature is just a resource waiting to be exploited. This is the world we chose when we made fairies safe. I do not know if we can go back. I do not know if we can reclaim the language of limits, of boundaries, of sacred spaces that must not be violated. But I know this: the old stories are still there, waiting, in dusty folklore collections, in the memories of those who remember, in the land itself, which has not forgotten, even if we have. And perhaps, if we are very lucky, we might still learn to listen, not to literal fairies, but to what the fairies represented, the voice of a world that is not ours to own, the knowledge that we are small, the understanding that some things are forbidden, and the warning that violating these truths has consequences. This is the dark truth about fairies. Not that they were malicious, not that they stole children or drowned travelers or demanded blood, but that they taught us limits, and we forgot. So we have walked together through the shadows, through the Sheely and Unsheely courts, through the horror of changelings and the violence of redcaps, through banshees and kelpies, through puck and leprechauns and household spirits, through the Victorian project of sanitization and the cultural amnesia that followed. And now you know what fairies really were before we made them safe. The question is, what do you do with this knowledge? You cannot unsee what you now understand. That tiny winged sprites are fiction, that fairy godmothers are Victorian invention, that the real folklore, the authentic tradition, was dark and dangerous and meant to teach you that the world does not belong to you. Perhaps you dismiss it. Perhaps you say, it is just old stories, superstition, irrelevant to modern life. And perhaps you are right. Or perhaps the next time you walk in an old forest, you will feel it. That sense of something watching, something old, something that was here long before you and will be here long after. And perhaps you will remember that our ancestors did not fear the dark because they were foolish. They feared it because they understood something we have forgotten, that we share this world, and that the things we share it with do not all wish us well. I am Mr. Ravenhurst. Thank you for walking with me through the forgotten darkness. Until we meet again in the shadows of history, sleep well, and if you hear music in the forest, do not follow it.